good evening, and welcome to another webinar organised by the Palestine Return Centre. My name is Mick Napier from the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign and currently involved in the Gaza Genocide Emergency Committees here in Scotland. So tonight we're going to take a long look. We're going to look back at the Balfour Declaration and the ramifications and how it led from that and how history has taken us from Balfour's Declaration to the present genocide unfolding in front of our eyes in Gaza and across Palestine. So it's an online panel discussion. We'll take a look at the Balfour Declaration, what it meant, and how that has led to the present day. We'll take a look at British relations, favourable relations, actually militant support for the Zionist project in Palestine, and how this has led from the erosion of Palestinian rights to the current genocidal violence. Our first speaker was to be Dr. Anne Irfan, but she's a COVID victim and unable to join us tonight. So we'll move immediately to a 12 or 15 minute introduction by Dr. Alice Pane-Pinto. Dr. Pane-Pinto is a reader in law at Queen's University Belfast. She researches, teaches and publishes on international law, human rights and transitional justice, especially focusing on the Middle East. Her most recent project on the displacement of Palestinian Bedouins was in collaboration with colleagues at Al-Quds University, Trinity College Dublin and Liverpool John Moores University. It was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Prior to joining QUB, Queen, oh my God, my knowledge of Irish academia is limited. Prior to joining QUB, and everyone knows what it means, Alice worked at Warwick University and outside academia on human rights and international law issues in the Middle East. When Alice lived in Palestine, she worked with a range of institutional, academic and civil society partners. She's a member of the Board of Trustees for Law for Palestine. Alice, we're talking about Balfour. We can't help but link it to the present day. Please share your thoughts with the viewers.
Mick, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you everyone for the invitation this evening to talk about this important and still relevant topic despite more than 100 years having passed. I'm probably going to get my slides in just a second. Thank you very much. So this evening, my colleague Bana Abuzuluf, who will present in a short while, and I will be talking about the Balfour Declaration in the context of transformative colonialism, going from the British role in the region, moving on to the international organizations, first the League of Nations and then the UN, and then from 1948 onwards, how colonialism took new forms. I will cover the first part up until 48, and my colleague Bana will take over from then. Right, so how the Balfour Declaration turned British imperialism in Palestine into a Zionist project endorsed by the international community is something that goes to the very heart of history, of legal history, but also of contemporary politics in the region, as I'm sure all of us are sadly aware of at this moment in time. British colonialism is the basis for Palestinian dispossession, and this is something that we should keep at the forefront of our minds whenever we talk about the situation in Palestine today. Without British colonialism and without British power at the moment in time that the Balfour Declaration was issued and thereafter, the situation in that part of the world would not be as it is. Palestinian dispossession, however, was not simply a project of British colonialism, as we all know. Palestinian dispossession, led by British colonial ideals, espoused the Zionist project, and in that guise, it was promoted by the international community. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But what I think is really important to remember is that the Balfour Declaration itself is symbolic, but it's what was done about the Balfour Declaration and how the international community accepted it and gave it some sort of political and legal legitimacy, despite the fundamentally flawed premises of the Declaration itself and the dubious legal value of what it was as a document. That is something that requires greater thought. There's a continuum, therefore, from the Balfour Declaration of 1917 to the present day in the Anglo, and by Anglo we mean UK, US, and more broadly the English-speaking Western world, support for the Zionist cause and the consequent dispossession and displacement of Palestinians. We all are very familiar with the concept of the ongoing Nakba, the idea of displacement that underpins the dispossession of Palestine and Palestinians. And I think that it's important to contextualize the Nakba from 1917 onwards. So it's not something that begins in the 1940s. The international community of Western states has been crucial, as I said moments ago. Balfour and what it came to represent began as a British project, but lives on as a dogma of the international community. We see this between 1917, when the declaration is issued, and 1920, San Remo Conference, setting out the terms of the British mandate in Palestine. We see it in how the League of Nations endorses this, and we see it in how the legacy of Balfour is incorporated in how the United Nations, upon its formation in 1945, dealt with the Palestine problem. So let's go back to that moment in time, right? So before World War I, we all know what British and other Western European powers' key interest was in the Middle East, right? Controlling trade routes. During World War I, however, there was another key reason for Britain to be particularly interested in that part of the world, needing to win, and that meant needing to defeat the Germans and their allies. The situation was looking grim for Britain and its allies, and it's in this context that we need to situate the Balfour Declaration. What's interesting, and this cannot be stressed enough, that the Balfour Declaration was issued before Britain occupied Palestine, and that's in December 17. The Balfour Declaration comes earlier than that, so it's unclear to commentators now and then what the basis for Britain giving away anything in that part of the world was. It wasn't even a colonial master at that point. It was projecting its colonial plans on the region and what it would do once it moved in. But even before Balfour, we know that Britain had been involved in planning the disposability of Palestine and the dispossession of Palestinian people. We know two key documents that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. We won't go into these in more detail, but this shows us how even before Britain formally occupied Palestine, it had already thought of that part of the world as if it was its own to dispose of as it wished. Despite the fact that, of course, there was a local population that was totally disregarded in all of this. Let's move on to the man himself, right? One author describes Lord Balfour as a Protestant colonialist who, far from being a friend of the Jewish people in Britain and abroad, had years earlier worked tirelessly for the enactment of stringent anti-immigration legislation, And that was aimed primarily to stop Jewish immigration into the UK. We're talking about the start of the 1900s, and Balfour had opposed the welcoming of refugees, Jewish refugees from Central and Eastern Europe quite vehemently. So this is the man. We're not talking about an enlightened thinker. We're talking about a politician who was operating as politicians do within a context. And this is the text of the Declaration itself, right? We see how it's penned and signed by Balfour himself. It's addressed to a private individual, as we all know, and yet it is on behalf of the government, after cabinet approval, that this letter is issued. What stands out from the letter? You're all familiar with the terms here. So it's a declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations. And it explains that Britain views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use Britain's best endeavours to facilitate that. As a small concession to the local indigenous population, the letter states that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. These are, of course, the indigenous Palestinian Arabs that made up, at that time, over 90% of the population, or indeed the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The worry among some British politicians, of course, was that by endorsing the Zionist cause, Jewish communities in Britain and elsewhere in Europe would be targeted as aliens who might be encouraged, or worse, to leave their homes in Western Europe and to emigrate to Palestine. So, the mindset of the Declaration is something that has been evaluated in the literature, both by academics and other commentators. One scholar describes it as arrogant, dismissive, and even racist. While another scholar talks about the mindset of the Declaration as revealing that notion of European Jews as carriers and transmitters of European civilization to the backward Orient. Now, this is something that we could elaborate on in more detail, but there's an underpinning two-tone racism. There's racism towards European Jews, and there's racism towards Palestinians in the Middle East. And it's this twin racism espoused by British colonial masters that leads us to the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration did not operate as a British project alone. It had been approved in advance by President Wilson of the US, and shortly after it was published, it was endorsed officially by France and Italy. If we review the Peel Commission report of 1937, there's an interesting quote by Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister at the time, and he told his interviewers that the Balfour Declaration was underpinned by propagandist reasons. Britain and her allies had suffered major defeats, and they were seeking the support of the American Jewish community to ensure that the war took a more favourable conclusion in favour of Britain and her allies. Something that I discovered reviewing the Peel Commission report was that the text of the Declaration was airdropped across Germany, Austria, Poland, and the Black Sea, in areas where sizable Jewish communities were living. So this is how the Declaration was endorsed by other great powers at the time. how it was thought of by the Prime Minister at the time, and how it was disseminated to communities outside of Britain. Now, Britain, as I said earlier, had occupied Palestine in December 17, and the best endeavours were internationalised. Between December 17 and September 23, Britain's colonial hold of Palestine received international endorsement, as I mentioned earlier. When the League of Nations set out the mandatory system, the former Ottoman Empire was carved up, and Palestine and its people were within the reach of the mandatory system. The British mandate for Palestine was formalised, as I said earlier, at the San Remo Conference of April 1920, which was confirmed by the League of Nations in 22. And that is the moment when it is constitutionalised, right? The dispossession of Palestine is constitutionalised through the colonial operation of Britain in the area. And of course, it came into operation formally in 23, but Britain had already had time to influence that initial moment of setting out dispossession. But let's look at the text of the mandate. It's quite remarkable. In the preamble, it says that the mandatory, that is Britain, becomes formally responsible for putting into effect the Balfour Declaration. Again, this is the moment that the Balfour Declaration, as some letter that Britain sends a private individual, becomes endorsed and formally part of the international legal order and is endorsed by the League of Nations. And this is, in my view, the turning point when it is no longer Britain leading the Zionist project in the Middle East, but it's the international community participating actively and facilitating the dispossession of Palestine. I've cited a few articles here. We've got placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions to secure the establishment of the Jewish national home. Right? We're not talking about the establishment of a Palestinian national home. Remarkably, the document recognized the Zionist organization and not local Palestinian groups as the public body for the purposes of advising and cooperating with the British administration of Palestine. And it continues talking about, the interest of the Jewish population in Palestine, again, not the interest of the local Palestinian population of Palestine. The mandate carries on and it encourages Jewish immigration in Palestine, but concedes that the rights and position of other sections of the population should not be prejudiced. That is, of course, the majority population. We're talking about over 90% of the inhabitants, which are the indigenous Palestinians at that time. What the mandate also does is establishes Hebrew as one of the official languages, erasing, of course, the centrality of the Arabic language, which, of course, is the language of Palestine and other Middle Eastern countries. So we see how this British broker dispossession substitutes the Palestinian natives with the Zionist representatives, right? I cite one of the key Palestinian historians here who talks about how the Palestinian Arabs were not given access to any significant positions of authority in the mandatory government, unlike what had happened elsewhere in parts of the world that Britain was controlling through different degrees of its imperial operations. But most importantly, Palestinians were not given the right to create their own powerful, autonomous parastate structure. It was the Zionist organizations that were given that privilege, right? And that is the constitutionalization endorsed by the international community in the League of Nations of how Palestinians were dispossessed by Britain and the international community. So what's the legacy? Well, the British Mandate ends in 1948. We all know about that chapter in history. It imposes colonialism. It imposes colonialism of a type that can still be seen today, and of course stifles the development of Palestinian life. It denies Palestinian indigenous leadership. It replaces the native population with a settler population, given priority in all matters, as I articulated by referencing the mandate document. And of course, in 37, it suggested partition. It handed over the Palestine problem in 47. That was because of a range of complex factors that many of you are well familiar with. And it's at that point in time that the UN takes over the project of colonialism and dispossession of Palestine, inheriting all the flaws of how the League of Nations before it had endorsed and enhanced the British project in the region, and how that led to establishing Jewish supremacy in that land. That left Palestine with no possibility to decolonize at a time when all other colonies around the world were struggling for independence. Palestine was recolonized. The structure of the mandate enabled Jewish supremacy in that land from that moment on.
Alice, could you bring your remarks to a close?
That's the last slide.
Perfect timing then.
Thank you, Mick.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Alice. Lots of questions. I'm sure they'll come up in the end of the discussion. Friends, our next contributor is Palestinian researcher Bana Abu Zuluf she's a PhD candidate in international law at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. Palestinian researcher, her interests are epistemic oppression, I'm sure she'll explain what that means, transitional justice, and decolonial solidarity. Decolonization, I looked up the acronym TWILE, Third World Approaches to International Law. It'd be interesting to see what people around the world think about this concept and international law vulnerabilities. Bana, please, the floor is yours to develop the points that have been made. 15 minutes, and then I'll politely interrupt.
Thank you so much, Mick, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I will be continuing my presentation, leaving Alice's section to move on to the Zionist colonization of 1948 till today. So I start by talking about really how the Balfour Declaration had triggered the Zionist colonization and the Nakba. As we've constantly, argued, me and Alice, we both believe that the Nakba didn't begin from 1948. It began way before that. It began actually in 1917. And it began with the idea that the Palestinians were just easily displaceable, or the idea of the displaceability of Palestinians. One of the most important things to mention here is that in fact, in the late 1930s, the British military trained Zionists in Palestine. At that time, it was approximately 5,500 soldiers that were trained, Jewish soldiers in guerrilla and counterinsurgency warfare, but they also trained a group called the Yishuv, which were led by David Ben Gurion, and with intelligence collection, so mapping Palestinian villages, which was quite very important for them to be able to control them in the consequences of what led to the 1948 Nakba. The group that was, trained has later been formed what we called then the Haganah, and has now actually become the Israeli Defense Forces. So you can see that sort of continuity of support there, in that, in fact, the British government and military helped, support and establish and push for the establishment of that military wing. At that time, the Haganah had a split, which caused the establishment of Ergon, which was another paramilitary wing, and that paramilitary wing was was leaning forward to this idea of, Jabotinsky at that time, that was, a bit different than that of Ben Gurion, and in it, which basically made this ideology of Jabotinsky made the Likud party today. And there's also another parliamentary wing that was also formed, which is the Stern Zionist group as well, paramilitary group. So we can see today that there's this also continuity again about this military training or military support. But in today's, even in today, we can see that the British government today, in fact, actually provides Israel with hundreds of millions of pounds. Some of the, in fact, materials for some of the aircrafts that are used to bomb Palestinians in Gaza are actually have licenses to export helicopters, drones, bombs, missiles, military technology, armored vehicles, tanks, ammunition, and small arms. So you can see how this sort of training has developed today, and it's never stopped. The sort of kind of promise, the Balfour promise to continue the support, has never stopped. But on the other hand, also, we've seen Palestinians receive only, humanitarian aid or calls for support through humanitarian aid from the government. And it's been also this regular support that the British government has for the UN Relief and Works Agency that works with Palestinian refugees, and sort of other humanitarian and developmental aid that is mainly, has developed into sort of a dichotomy, a paradox between this massive support, unconditional, you can call it, unwavering support for the state of Israel, but at the same time providing humanitarian aid for Palestinians only. And at the same time as well, 106 years has passed since the Balfour Declaration, and yet, we see that, until today there's a clear British complicity. More than ever, it's more clear today than it was before. But I would like to also just step back a little bit and spotlight on Gaza. In fact, a Palestinian historian by the name Khalid Audatullah has mentioned something quite interesting about the relationship between the Balfour Declaration and Gaza. So apparently, I will read, in fact, the quote myself. In the First World War, on the 31st of October 1917, the British forces had completed their occupation of the city of Beersheba, which is in fact actually the same called as Naqab as well, to circumvent Gaza's fortified defenses, which repelled two major British attacks in March and April of 1917. In the second attack, the British forces used chemical weapons densely and then began to advance towards Gaza through a series of battles along the Gaza Valley. The fall of Gaza was the fall of the fortified defensive line of Jerusalem and Palestine in what was known as the Third Battle of Gaza. As soon as the news of its fall reached the British Ministry of War or Defence in London, Lord Mark Sykes has come out joyfully, bringing the good news to Chaim Weizmann, who was waiting in the Ministry of War, announcing the approval of the announcement of the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, 1917, and the birth of the bloody Anglo-Zionist project in our country, Palestine, that extended to this day. This is a quote by the historian himself. And another element as well is that we see today, in fact, actually, is the how Balfour is being mirrored today in the statements that are happening, that are targeted at the slaughter of people in Gaza. One of the statements, and I quote many here today, is one by the Keir Starmer UK Labour, who mentioned, in fact, that they support in Israel's the right to defend itself, but also they say that any operation must be done within international law, and I quote and I put in I highlight we democracies know that all human life is equal, and I put that in an ironic way, just to show the irony of how the UK government has not called for a ceasefire, and again showing that a specific line to show how the hypocrisy of this government, but also the paradox that constantly shows in wavering support as well. But also, we've seen the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's statement as well. The same paradox as well is apparent here, that he supports the deployment of RAF, and Royal Navy assets, but also at the same time believes that the UK government will support and should support humanitarian efforts. In fact, actually, he does mention the Balfour Declaration, even in that statement, addressing the House of Commons, which is quite interesting, in fact, because it's himself calling that the interesting link, not nobody else, in fact. But also there's a Braverman tweet as well, by mentioning again this kind of continuity of the support Balfour promise here, saying that that UK stands shoulder and shoulder with Israel, but also calling people in Gaza as evil, so and that they support Israel in fighting that evil. Again, the tactics of not only reducing the people, to not important or non-negotiable or irrelevant, or to completely disregard the communities, but now there's this humanization element there. That is often, mirrored by this kind of, Balfour promise, this kind of Balfour mentality as well, as we like to say it. But also this kind of, the concept of this Anglo-Zionist colonization is important here, because it is not important to look at the Balfour Declaration or the Balfour Promise as a promise for the creation of the Zionist entity. It's a promise to continue that sort of support, to continue the existence of that Anglo-Zionist colonization, and that it, in fact, it is apparent and very visible to people, that sort of support, even in times that it's hard to even justify, as Palestinians are, even the communities, not just the, Palestinians, but also communities and the public are protesting, and the government are at the same time on another level justifying that, violence. So again, we see the same continuity here of this paradox of, we are committed to helping civilians and humanitarian assistance, but we also are, as well, we believe that, we support Israel's right to defend itself. So again, this idea of both unwavering support for Israel versus humanitarian aid for Palestinians. And we can see that, by refusing to recognize Palestinian right to self-determination, by refusing to or ignoring the underlying causes of Palestinian dispossession, oppression, they effectively deny that sort of agency for Palestinians. And in fact, providing only passive assistance through humanitarian aid, we can see that the British government cements the status of Palestinians as a subordinate group who needs to receive only conditional support upon their acceptance of the two-state solution, but also the acceptance of the larger status quo of Israeli dominance and ethnic cleansing. So again, we can see that this forced attachment of humanitarian aid in statements by British politicians, about the slaughter in Gaza shows clearly the erroneous logic by which humanitarian support becomes inhumane, and by which the British government holds on for dear life their British colonial legacy in Palestine. So we can see that, this idea of, the line that Alice pointed out in the Balfour Declaration, the line about, about non-Jewish communities, as in to the idea of no harm, or the idea of sort of humanitarian kind of element there, is not just visible in that declaration itself, but also visible until today. There's a continuity that has not ended. And also, so 106 years on, the Balfour's colonial promise lives on in the actions of the British government, as its manifestation, which is the Zionist entity, is challenged in Palestine right now, and particularly in Gaza. So as before the declaration of the Balfour, announcement of the declaration of the Balfour Declaration, they made a bet on the fall of Gaza, and so they do today. But that fall of Gaza today means for them the genocide and the death of Gaza. So you can see that continuation of violent colonization until today. That until today, Gaza maintains as a central element in fighting that sort of continuity, that legacy of British colonial and Anglo-Zionist presence in Palestine. And I will leave it there. Thank you. Yeah, you are muted, Mick.
Thank you very much. Trying to communicate while muted. It's a little bit like trying to convey the truth of what's going on in Gaza, living in Britain today. Bana, thank you very much for that contribution. Our next contributor will be Dr. Shari Plonsky. Dr. Plonsky is a senior lecturer in international politics at Queen Mary University in London. Her work is anchored in the politics of Palestine and the Israeli state. She focuses on colonial relations and the struggles that reveal and challenge them. She also co-produces a podcast called Surviving Society Presents Material Crimes. Well, I'm going to listen into that tonight. Shari, your view, it's terrible times. We can see genocide on TV. How does that relate to Mr. Balfour?
Thanks, Mick, for the introduction. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and anyone's thoughts on listening to this podcast that we've done as a project that very much ties into, I guess, what I'm going to talk about tonight. And also thanks very much to the Palestine Return Center for inviting me, and to Alice and Bana for kind of setting the scene that I think also really ties into what I think my intervention is about. But to be honest, as I said, I feel a bit at a loss like for words, a loss for how to speak or analyze or really just reckon with this moment in Palestine and its long sutured relationship to the UK in a lucid, articulate way. When every morning I'm scrolling through images of rubble and ruin and material dust that represents these kind of the violent experience of Palestinians in Gaza and beyond from the night before. Materials, to be honest, are actually my archive, my method of understanding and conceptualizing. And I think like all of us now, that they're choking me. So when I originally agreed to do this talk, I was very sure about what I wanted to say. I was going to talk about my work on corridor infrastructures, and specifically Israel's reinvention and self-branding as this kind of node in global circuits of trade and capital accumulation, via its kind of semi-newly formed physical and affective pathways to normalization with the Gulf and the wider Middle East. And how that is really tied into these legacies of Balfour, the Mandate, and colonial infrastructures. And that this is happening against, or rather with, 75 years of Israel's fortified frontierism and its still undefined borders of enclosure and isolation vis-a-vis the Middle East, while building into and over Palestine. I wanted to tell you all about how important it is to look at the region and Israel's positioning within it through the lens of this infrastructure that once went nowhere, like this train that was re-inaugurated in 2016 between Haifa and Beit Sha'an, today called the Ha'emek Railway, tied to, I guess, allegedly tied to a Hijazi railway, which travels literally 65 kilometers through 9 stops and stops 4 kilometers short of the border with Jordan, but is slowly inching its way, at least in a kind of imagined geography, to going everywhere, exactly as Israel had always hoped, dreamed, and planned. And building from its own racial lens and the lens of global investors, including tycoons from India, port operators from China, benefactors from the UK, calling itself a villa in the jungle, Israel has over the last 2 decades, now very much amplified by the 2020 Abraham Accords, reorganized much of its political, economic, and financial practices towards an evolving line of infrastructural connection and circulation, these kind of tightly controlled, securitized networks of collaboration, still with gaps, but it feels or has felt like those gaps were closing between itself and other alleged islands of stability and of security in the region and beyond. I was also going to tell you about how important it is to see these lines of connection as having what Aya Nasser and Omar Jabari Salamanca call traces. Haunted by colonial histories, they are bound up with material violence in the present because of who made them, who invested them, who is and was displaced by them, who they connect, and who and what is left out, as well as who and what are left then to ruin and ruination, to use Anne Stoller's really eloquent language. That the solid, often uninterrogated physical world in which we are embedded has so much to tell us about violence, because the physical linkages of trade and transit systems, the things that we really don't see, and yet sustain, secure, and make possible the colonial and capitalist relations that underwrite them, that makes them work, is bound up with violence, whether it's visible or not. As Dori Massey has explained, to make some things or people or ideas move, others must necessarily be blocked. And honestly, is there a better way of understanding Israel and Palestine than this idea that to make Israel work, move, be mobile, be normal, Palestine can't be any of those things? And I was going to talk to you also about how Deb Cowan's work on rail infrastructures and empire have inspired me to follow this infrastructure back to its imperial origins, to tell stories about how I'm doing this work, finding the current fetishization of corridor infrastructures entangled in the particular instance of empire that we're talking about today, where Balfour set in motion a vision for Palestine that fit perfectly with British racial economic governance then and now. Something we definitely see so easily in the yearly celebrations and commemorations of Balfour's Declaration of, as Alice put it, Britain's sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations in Palestine. And as Vanna pointed out, Britain's ongoing commitment to its relationship to the Jewish state, as so clearly expressed this past month in Rishi Sunak's visit to Israel, in Keir Starmer's refusal to call for a ceasefire, in public statements by every institution in this country that they stand with Israel, even as hundreds of thousands of people march in the street in solidarity with Palestinian people and with Palestine. And maybe we need to keep that in the back of our minds for a moment, that the state is not necessarily the people. Now, all of this resonates with the particular language Balfour used to describe Palestine as, and there's been multiple speeches like this, where he said, a small, petty country, that describes Palestine as a small, petty country, geopolitically, developmentally, despite the fact that it also occupies such an important place in the history of the world. That the fact that it had become stagnant is because of its native populations, Palestinians, and that it requires, for it to become a site of imperial progress, people who have the necessary skill, knowledge, perseverance, and enterprise. And that he, and I'm again quoting here, was perfectly convinced that when you are talking of the Jews, you will find no want of any of these requisites. And we hear in this like incredible racist language for all the people involved. And we find in Shireen Sekali's work, how she put it in this beautiful piece about her great-grandfather and his positioning in the racial project of imperial time, initiated by Balfour and the British imperial interest he represented, that the British mandate in Palestine envisioned a future for the land, but not for its people. From the Permanent Mandates Commission's perspective, these Palestinians kept the country in a state of stagnation. The land needed an able and energetic people to facilitate its arrival to a modern temporality. And that when the League of Nations took up that mantle, concretizing Balfour's promise to help build a Jewish nation in Palestine into the legal scaffolding of the mandate system, the particular racial and colonial logics I see unfolding into contemporary infrastructures of normalization were already germinating. and became the essence of British developmental practice in Palestine, just as it had been throughout the empire. Because isn't this the period that we talk about of development, experimentation, of the making of ports, pipelines, roads, railways, refineries, military bases, and urban industries, of extracting and circulating potash and petroleum, of drawing new flattened lines of circulation between even India and Palestine, Jordan and Iraq, connecting the dots between Mosul and Haifa and London. It is always about the corridor between allegedly the civilized stations made safe for the journeys of empire. I wanted to talk about infrastructure as living in and with multiple tenses, that to grapple with Israel's normalization infrastructure, like these dense materials that structure global trade, the monstrous offshore ports, the road and rail lines slowly moving and connecting the line between, let's say, the UAE, the larger Gulf, and Haifa, as well as the virtual, financial, and less visible lines of connection and cooperation around technology, security, culture, even tourism, that we need to see this infrastructural terrain both as presentist in the sense of inherently working to erase the past, erase the traces to their colonial extractive purpose and beneficiaries, seeming like they have always been, and yet also as imminent promise, as somehow always living in the future, surrounded by the language of linear development, progress, modernism, as carrying us forward into this kind of shinier, happier, safer, more secure, and inevitable future. This was the case in Balfour's many proclamations about scientific and economic development in Palestine, and it's something we see all the time in propaganda today, proclaiming the wonder and necessity of contemporary infrastructure projects. And because of that presentist and futurist ahistorical mode of being, these infrastructures become, at least in terms of visibility or in terms of our geopolitical imagination, disentangled from the violence that made them, that enables them, and that they enable. And I wanted to point us to how violence is always part of the port projects, the cities and lines of the future, the investments circulating between Israel and the Gulf to advance desert and medical tech, let's say, the plans to connect Haifa and Dubai. All of this makes possible and is entangled in the violence that contains and secures and erases Palestine. And that it is imperative for us to make those connections and to do the work of tracing and understanding and making visible the violence of mobile logistics infrastructures, to see beyond the spectacles of violence, throughout Palestine and in Gaza, in the West Bank, on the front lines. But today, and this week, and this month, I have been consumed, as I know we have all been, with the spectacles. And I find it hard to see or talk or write about anything else. And at the same time, even as I study normalization and all these investments in the Israeli project, in the project of stability and security in the region, this idea that they need to make it safe for capitalist flows that are entrenched in deeply racialized logics and modes of governance of this kind of idea of the Middle East as darker space. And I also study the histories of empire and British imperial logics that echo every specter of that project, I am still completely in shock at the UK government's response to it and much of the Anglo-Western world. But I'm also, and this is kind of what I want us to keep in our minds, I'm also completely energized and inspired by mobilizations around and against what the UK government is doing. That something seems to have shaken ordinary people into being in the street with Palestine and with Palestinians, reminding me very much to look up from Balfour, from the mandate, from British support for the giant Zionist project in Palestine, from the infrastructures that make racial capitalism and colonialism work, to the anti-colonial circuits that shadow every aspect of this and has for, as long as the British Empire has been in business, to the people of Palestine who refuse to accept Israel's mobile and carceral infrastructure as facts. Or at least that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to hold on to as I, again, troll through the news, the rubble, the material archive of Israel's intended genocide in Gaza and in Palestine. And that's what I have to say today. Thank you for having me.
All trying to cope, trying to make sense of, trying to understand how to respond to the barbarism. I believe the Israelis were bombing bakeries yesterday. So yeah, that shadow looms over all of us, and as you say, the determination of a huge number of people to do something to try to stop it. Thanks, Shari. Our final speaker tonight is Rami Khouri, a distinguished public policy fellow at the American University in Beirut. He's director of Anthony Shadid Archives, a research project at the American University of Beirut. He's an author and columnist. In the past 50 years, he's been a journalist, analyst, and teacher in the Middle East, and most recently was also director of global engagement and a journalist in residence at the American University of Beirut, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Previously executive director of the Daily Star newspaper in Beirut, and jumped over a few borders and became editor-in-chief of the Jordan Times. Rami was awarded the Pax Christi International Peace Prize for 2006, and he's been a visiting scholar at Harvard, Mount Holyoke, Princeton. I'm going to stop there, Rami. It goes on for too long. Serves on the Joint Advisory Board of the Northwestern University Journalism School in Doha in Qatar. Rami, we've got some time left after reading your CV. These are hellish times. How do you link Balfour giving Palestine to European colonists with what we're seeing on our TV screens today? The floor is yours, Rami.
Hello to everybody. This is Rami Khouri. I'm speaking from Amman, Jordan, and I'd like to thank the Palestine Return Center for organizing this gathering. Thank the other speakers and panelists and all the audience and people who are watching online. This really is an occasion to look at the issues that the panelists are going to be discussing at a moment of great danger and tension and destruction and death in Palestine and parts of Israel. And this raises important issues about the nature of this conflict, it's lasting for so many years, and how the Balfour Declaration plays into this. We are today 100 years exactly after the 1923 official handing of the mandate, the League of Nations mandate in Jordan, and Palestine and Jordan, handing that mandate to Great Britain. And that was 6 years after the Balfour Declaration, when Great Britain declared that it would support the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, at a time when, of course, Palestine was 93% or so Arab, and the small indigenous Jewish minority had been there for years, living peacefully. But in the 100 years, a lot has happened. And two things I think I want to point out today, and maybe a third. The fact that the principles underlying the Zionist movement that have been active for the last century continue to be active in all of their destruction and material criminality and political violence. Second thing is that the Palestinian people have continued to resist peacefully most of the time, sometimes militarily when nothing happens to the peaceful protest, when the world remains silent. And the third important thing is that the process of creating a Jewish state in a land that was 93% Palestinian could only happen with the collusion, direct involvement of the colonial power of the day, which was the United Kingdom, Great Britain. And now that role is played by the United States. It's important to knit these three things together and to understand where we are and how this came about. The important thing to keep in mind, I believe, about Zionism and then the State of Israel after 1948 is that it has always pursued a series of principles. And these principles allowed it to create the Jewish state, Israel, a majority Jewish state, with about a quarter of it, 20% is not Jewish, it's Palestinian, Christian, and Muslim, but the principles that allowed Zionism to succeed and that have continued with the State of Israel include, first of all, the continuous use of violence to drive out Palestinians from the land and replace them with Jewish settlers. Another principle is that the Jewish people have priority rights in Palestine over the Palestinians or anybody else. And they claim that the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandate gives them this right, which most of the world rejects. The vast majority of the world says that there should be equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians in two adjacent states, or if they want a single state or whatever they decide to do, but there's no superior rights and privileges and sovereignty for Zionists, Jews, or Israelis in Palestine, and this has to be ended at some point soon to reach a point where you have equal rights and equal protected, secure, recognized statehood for both people. The other principle that is important in the Zionist-Israeli saga of the last century has been the continual support of a major or the leading Western colonial and imperial power. And this is Great Britain and the United States. These are not just colonial and imperial powers. They're also racist powers that give more rights to white people from the West than to darker people from the South, to put it in its simplest term. And they're also militaristic powers, that they will use their force to bring about anything that they feel serves the colonial enterprise. In the 1920s, the British thought that having a Jewish state would help them in World War I and afterwards, and in their competition with the French and others and other purposes, and their imperial roots. So the British supported the Zionists all out. And later on, when the U.S. took over from the British as the major Western imperial power, it kept that process going, where the Israelis got superior support, military support, economic, political support to the Palestinians.
Rami. Has Rami dropped off? Friends, I'm not sure what's happening at the moment. Rami, can you hear me? Sorry, Amr? Well, friends, I'm at a loss. We seem to have lost Rami Khouri, and that's a huge pity, given the clarity and lucidity of his initial remarks. I'm sure our technical people are trying to bring him back in again. Shall we proceed to a discussion with our other speakers who are still here? Bana and Shari. We've lost Rami, what a pity. I hope he'll come back. But in the meantime, if you were trying to draw a line between Balfour and the bloody carnage we are seeing on our screens today, what items would you stress, Bana and then Shari?
I honestly believe that it is hard to see what's happening in Gaza without seeing that, this constant support for the state of Israel, and this constant, not just military support, but strategic support and unconditional support has caused Israel to believe that they can do whatever they would like to do without any consequences. So this impunity has caused them to in fact not only commit genocide, and not only commit to the slaughter of civilians in daylight, but also to say publicly the intent of that, and to say it so shamelessly. But also it's a sort of treatment that has been passed on, since the Balfour Promise. The idea that unconditional support, we will establish a state, and not only a state for you, we will also make sure that during the time we will control the Palestinian population during the British Mandate to allow for that state to be created. We will train your forces and paramilitary wings. We will support you with military aid until the end of times. And this promise continued until today. I don't think it's shocking, the type of UK support. It's a natural continuity of that colonial mindset that the British colonizers have. And again, there's this concept, or there's a saying of, you cannot ask the colonizers of the past to justify or to end the colonizers of the present, or to stop basically the colonizers of the present. And I think that's what it is. People who want to emit that sort of history there, or what we call the commitment to the dehistoricization of what happened, are really just clearly doing whatever in their possible way to justify the genocide of people in Gaza.
Dana, let me bring in Shari. You're making the point about colonialism in general, the bloody violence. 3 million Bengalis dead in a famine. The last human being wiped out, the last black human being wiped out in Tasmania. The bloody history, the violent history of European colonialism. The biggest genocide in the history of the world, visited upon the people of Central and South America after European contact. Shari, is Israel just another bog standard settler colonial state? What's special about it?
Thanks, Pana. That was so articulate in terms of understanding. So I just wanted to add on to that, and then I can answer that question. But I think that the word that we need to come back to, or the way that I think is really helpful to come back to, is to think about the way that race and racial capitalism are kind of sutured to that continuum, right? That the idea, and that also that the violence that you just mentioned, Mick, and all of these examples, this is why I look at infrastructure and colonial infrastructure as the productive side to the to the negative side of colonialism, that you have the actual active erasure of the active killing, the active displacement, but it doesn't work without the productive creation of legal systems, physical infrastructures, trade, and all of these other ways that we made it legitimate for something like today to happen. It is about legitimacy and normalizing this project through a kind of language and a conceptualization of race and capitalism as belonging to particular people, particular groups that have that sense of progress. And in terms of is Israel just another bog standard settler colonial state? Obviously, yes and no. The thing about settler colonialism is that it lands. It has to be territorialized, and in that territorialization, it encounters and is acted through history. All settler colonial projects have similar, threads and similar traits, but they all actually had something happen differently on the ground because of who was enacting it, their particular moment in history, but also the one that we leave out, Palestinian resistance changed the nature of that project. It would not be in the shape it is if Palestinians hadn't resisted, continued to resist, continued to not let go of the idea that of the Nakba, that is the idea of resistance as a structure, as well as the colonialism as a structure. And I think that is what makes it a different, and we see it throughout the world, that indigenous populations resist colonialism, and so each one of them takes up a different shape in history and in the present. And then I would also add to that, this investment in Israel that I've been watching and seeing and kind of tracing in the last few years of my work, but in general, I would trace it really in the last 20 years. There's been a shift that ties together kind of neoliberalism, racial capitalism, and their colonial project in Palestine. Their entire economic system has shifted towards a global economic system that has also kind of put Israel back into this idea of they're the ones to do progress, they're the ones to do economic success. And there is also racism even in that, like a philosophicism in that kind of a belief that really resonates so completely with the way Balfour saw science. It's amazing.
Yeah, Anna, I mean, the whole project is saturated in not just racism, but the most intense racism, the privileging of one group over another. I was just looking at something where the first president of Israel reported that Balfour went to see a lady called Cosima Wagner, who was a notoriously vicious anti-Semite, and later reported, Balfour later reported to Weizmann that he shared her anti-Semitic postulates. Now that's not just an anti-Semite; she was an icon of the Nazis, actually, in terms of extreme anti-Semitism, and of course the racism towards Palestinians, dismissing them as of no value, to be dispossessed, to be brutalized. The British Army held them down while the Zionists were too weak to hold them down. What's your thoughts about the role of Britain in leading from Balfour to the current carnage and pay-per-view genocide watching, really? Bana.
Yeah, this is a very kind of, interesting question, because, like, as you see, the interesting element of anti-Semitism plays an important role into Zionist thought, and also into Zionist colonization as well. The idea that we must not only weaponize it, but we must also understand that anti-Semitism could also be used favorably for the conditions of the Jewish people, or for the Zionist cause. This idea, in fact, very, very problematic idea, that you can ally yourself with anti-Semites only if it causes or ensures the strength of the state of Israel, and this is not new. As you mentioned yourself, the idea that we must have this constant fear mongering in the West about the reality and the fear that we must use that fear there, and we must not only use it, but we must use it in a strategic manner, not against the Europeans, because the Europeans now are our allies, which is interesting, because now they call as we mentioned, Balfour being an anti-Semite himself, this idea of allyship with these people. So now what we want to do is that we want to paint our enemies, whoever is our enemy is an anti-Semite, and we've seen that smearing campaigns. It's nonetheless it's very exhaustive, but also to just mention this idea of this continuity again. Balfour wasn't able to, what Balfour wasn't a promise for the Jewish people. It was a promise for the Europeans as well. It was a promise that Europeans will no longer have to deal with the Jewish problem that they had. It was the promise of anti-Semitism. That's what it is. It was a promise that they must have to. They will end. They will not answer the question of Palestine, which is often used in UN as well documents, the question of Palestine or the Palestine question. In fact, actually, it was not the Palestine question that they were solving. They were solving the Jewish question because they're anti-Semites. They were trying to justify their anti-Semitism by arguing that the problem here is that what shall we do with the Palestinians now? But the actual reality is that what they wanted to do with the Jewish people, absolutely, horrific anti-Semitism that they justified, again, with their support of the state of Israel. As long as you support now the state of Israel, then your anti-Semitism, even if it's very outwards, it can be justified. So again here, and as we see what's happening in Gaza, people are no longer even discussing this issue, this idea that the Palestinians have the right to resist the history, this continuous history of colonization, of brutality, this idea that Palestinians should just constantly be silent, this idea of removing the agency from Palestinians, this idea of even putting Gaza as if it's separate from the Palestinian reality, as if Gaza is some sort of outside body. But also, this idea of constant dehumanization rhetoric of and as again we say, racialized logic as well, this idea of Palestinians as barbaric, this constant usage of barbaric. We've seen that a lot in statements, the barbaric kind of use. So again, it's all meant to do something. Again here, it's all meant to justify something, and also to justify another, to justify the genocide and the carnage of what's happening in Gaza, but also to justify why they must do it as well, because the barbarity, because Palestinians are worthless, their lives don't matter. Again, there's also this idea of as violence being inherent in the Palestinian identity, the idea that Palestinians are inherently violent. So the idea is that there was always violence anyway, but now is the time to solve this violence, and by solving this violence, for them it meant the destruction and the killing of babies, of children in Gaza, and absolutely horrific. I don't know what to say, to be honest. I share Shari's position as well. It's that it's appalling. Is all I can say.
Right. The Zionists are seeking peace, as a peaceful cemetery. Shari, I always like the story. I think it illuminates Palestine, that a lot of black people in North America believed that they couldn't fight racism. Marcus Garvey got back to Africa. Now let's go back to Africa because North America is a dead loss. We have to get out. And of course, when black people decided to go back to Africa, well, they'd never been, most of them, the Ku Klux Klan paid some tickets, did a fundraiser for them in New York. The alliance between the most vicious anti-Semites and people who give up on fighting racism and go and colonize on other people seems natural. Does that? What do you think about the seemingly permanent series of alliances between the Zionists and some of the worst anti-Semites, Orban, Bolsonaro, all sorts of people like that? Your comments, Shari.
So it's interesting, as Bana was talking, immediately the first thing I thought about is how many times you hear Israel's political leadership, in particular Netanyahu, in solidarity with people like Donald Trump, extreme right-wing movements in the US, extreme right-wing movements all over Europe, because of this shared deep anti-Palestinian and Islamophobic and racist kind of shared belief system, right? With people who are very vocally anti-Semitic. And I think the point that Bana made about this comes all the way back to the British project in Palestine. There was nothing about that project that was about really being in sympathy with a Jewish people or a Zionist project in that sense. But you see in speeches over and over again, this project of there's two sides to it. There's the kind of I guess it's called, there's the side of it where they believe in the race of the Jews, and you see it also in the Peel Commission. You see it also in later writings that the Jews are the kind of middlemen of progress in the region, that they're European enough to travel with the European project, that they could be colonizers, whereas the native Palestinian people needed protection, humanitarian. It's exactly what Bana said. Bana and Alice gave that, really gorgeous presentation, which is exactly what you read in all of this literature. And that at the same time, when we see that Balfour in 1905 is I guess is producing that I think it's the Aliens Act or Anti-Aliens Act, where you can't have immigration of Jews coming from pogroms, and tied to the fact that he then supported this idea of Jews in Palestine is absolutely about how do you transit Jews out of the UK, who they saw at the time as poor, as working class, as also part of really strong labor movements at the time as well, right? They were quite part of radical movements at the time. And so it is amazing how all of that gets tied up in the project of Zionism. And it is, we see it all the time that for the Israeli state, the partners, it doesn't matter who the partner is, like as long as they support the complete erasure of Palestine. It's become like, and you see it all the time in this is not new this week. This has been going on for years and years with Netanyahu, always like arm in arm with, at least verbally, arm in arm with the extremist right wing, especially like, and also like you see this kind of molding together since 2001, and like, you know, this alleged war on terror that ties up terror with the idea that Arab people, that brown people are dangerous or terrorists. Like it ties up also with that racial colonial project, and works perfectly with how Israel operates and has marshaled that language. And like for me, again, in my work, I'm looking at how that's been marshaled into kind of a business project, a branding project that is part of the support that we see happening in the last, you know, bunch of years in Israel, and its project to rewrite the map of the Middle East.
Shari,
Again,
sorry to interrupt, Shari. Let me try and get a few finishing comments from both of you before I'm under orders to knock off at 8:30. Otherwise, I'd love to continue. Vanna, you can't buy and sell black people unless you dehumanize them. You can't say they're equal to us and then buy and sell them like dogs. Racism's part of the deal. You're teaching and working in Ireland. I mean, the racism against the Irish in the past was as vicious as against any other people. Thick, stupid, violent, savage barbarians whom civilized Britain had to, well, kill and civilize. So the demonization of colonial people, especially those who resist, and that's all of them, is inevitable in the project, isn't it? Can you make some comments on that? And then I'll go over to Shari and wind up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently based in Ireland, and it's hard to just forget again about the kind of British colonial presence in Ireland as well. One of the things that like was quite interesting for me to learn while I was here is knowing the fact of a British, army general at that time was based in the north of Ireland, called Ronald Storrs, and he said that if in relation to the state of Israel, is that the state of Israel for the West was like a loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. So for them, it was very important that Britain creates the state of Israel, and again, this just reminded me again of the importance of solidarity, but also knowing about this history as well, of racism, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, this kind of idea as well. But also one of the things that I understood from studying as well colonial and decolonial movements is that there was constantly this dehumanization of resistance to any colonial domination. This is not new. This is not odd. I remember there was a specific book that I was reading, and it was so appalling for me seeing an image of people of Haiti, so the Haitians, painted as people with red horns, as in like they're evil, they're the devils themselves, when they were fighting against the colonizers, the French and the British. So again, looking at this idea that anti-colonial struggle, painting and dehumanizing, demonizing resistance is not new. I think it's not new, and it's not particular to Palestinians, and it's not particular to the Palestinian situation, and it's been used before. And it's continued until today. Nobody's going to be no colonial or past colonizer or colonist country would be saying positive things about a decolonial movement. And again, to see that this idea, there's a constant need again to look at resistance movements in Palestine with the lens that we must identify them with a sort of moral lens of, well, we must endure the violence. The Palestinians must endure the violence, but when they resist, they must resist in sort of way that the colonizer approves of. So in a sort of kind of a moral capacity that the Western democracies, or whatever you want to call it, ironically, approves of. So again, this idea, it's not new, and we're, it's hard to make a case in the moral sense of why, decolonial movements are going to have to be adopting violent tactics. I mean, we've seen that in Ireland, and I'm very familiar with that as well, being here in myself. But also we've seen that, right now in Palestine, is that even BDS was demonized, even, doing, boycott campaigns in stores, or even talking about Palestine in academic institutions, where like you'd have to, sign that you will not boycott Israel, or that you will not say anything about Israel, that you would have to be, very, have to, comply with these kind of IHRA, definitions of anti-Semitism, which basically stipulate that you must not criticize the state of Israel. So all these kind of restrictions that were used on nonviolent resistance all so far up until now. So there's no intention of supporting any sort of form of any resistance from Palestinians to begin with. That was just the established idea. But also to believe that the Western governments do not know that settler colonization, or that Israel is a settler colonial apartheid movement, is to say that they are just ignorant, that they are just unaware. But we must stop that nonsense, and we must say that no, they're aware of it, they're supporting it, they've started it, they initiated it, and they've constantly supported it with unconditional support. So we must just put it there, and we say that this is active complicity, this is active commitment, and Palestinians are going to have to fight this fight, and unfortunately, they are fighting this fight alone, as we see.
Thanks, Bana. Shari, what can we say? When I was a youth, we were told that Vietnam had invaded Vietnam, and the Americans had to go in and stop it, and kill 3 million Indo-Chinese. We see a bloody. There's been no normalization except war and counterinsurgency since 1945. The horror we're witnessing, and millions are trying to come to terms with in Gaza. It's not so exceptional, is it? But we still have to fight it, just as we fought and defeated American militarism over the issue of Vietnam. We won. How can we? We need to win this time, don't we?
I'm not quite sure if there was a question, but there is a final comment. But it
was just an inflection at the end. We have to fight and we have to win, don't we?
No, but we do. But I think it is I think we all get swallowed by feeling helpless, and futile and angry and full of rage that we end up internalizing to ourselves, and but at the same time, the actions in, at least where I am in the UK, are amazing. And I think we hold on to that and we go. We just, stop our normal, whatever normal life that we think is normal. And we stop making it normal that what is happening is normal. And the amazing actions that people are doing, and even doing against the ridiculous attempts to silence people, because they're not going to be silenced, I think believing that it's just going to happen, it doesn't have to. I'm done with that. I think the amount of energy and active, but also that it's not just about now, right? The one thing that I would like to end with is it's not about a ceasefire, it's not about just ending this right this minute of quiet. It's about not back to normal. It is about supporting BDS. It is about supporting the end of this colonial project in Palestine. It is about, a liberation project that is not just about ending this violence right now. That's kind of where I would end my comments?
Well, friends, with those words, I'll thank Bana Abu Zalouf and Shari Plonsky. These are desperate times and call for resolute responses. It's great to see people occupying, 1,000 Jews occupying Central Station in New York, and masses of people at Liverpool Street Station. There are plans to occupy lots of railway stations across the UK and to escalate further, because we marched by the million to stop the invasion of Iraq, but we failed. The devastation of Afghanistan, we did not succeed in stopping that. Libya, Yemen, and so on. So we have to do this, not just for the Palestinians, but for our own sake as well. So I want to thank all our guests, especially Bana and Shari, who are still here. It's a pity we lost one of the guests. I hope maybe the PRC can arrange an interview so that he can say what he started to say very eloquently, and we can share that. But friends, this is Mick Napier, thanking our guests, thanking the PRC for organising this event, and saying thank you to all for listening. Let's go forth and let's organise in support of the Palestinian people. This ethnic cleansing is happening across the whole of Palestine. A strong solidarity movement can reduce the cost to the people struggling against colonialism by an amount we'll never know, but it can reduce the cost. Those are the lessons of previous solidarity campaigns. Friends, thank you and good night from Mick Napier on behalf of the Palestine Return Centre. Good night.